So, good evening, class. I cannot see I can only see one face, but I know there is a lot more out there. So welcome. Let me just remind you what we're doing here. This is a course on what we call dynamic capabilities and related paradigms, and I'm going to bookend the class. So I'm giving you a superficial introduction to dynamic capabilities and related paradigms at the beginning of the class, and I'll probably go over the same material at the end. But by the time we go over it at the end of the class, we will have drilled much deeper, and we will hopefully have a much richer understanding of these ideas, which I'm presenting to you in simple form, but there's a lot more complexity and elaboration on every single point. So with that, let me remind you again that we are we gave a little introduction last time to say that in a world of deep uncertainty, you need a different way of managing, and we call that dynamic capabilities. And we're breaking dynamic capabilities down into three clusters. There was sensing and sense making, there's seizing and transforming. And today we're continuing to discuss what I called seizing, or you might want to call it execution, but it's really about investing in the right way behind new opportunities. Remember, we talked a little bit about Xerox. Did a fantastic job of figuring out that not only was computing coming, that personal computing was coming. They hired a whole bunch of engineers, set up what was Xerox PARC with a budget of 100 to 200 million a year. This is back in the late 60s. That's a lot of money. Probably $750 million a year, something like that. Assembled the most creative people in the world, and the world's greatest computer scientists, and computer science was new at that time. And they created all the key elements of the personal computer. The GUI interface, Ethernet, laser printers, the mouse, all of this came out of Xerox PARC. But the management back in Stamford, Connecticut, when it came to, all right, now we got to spend $1 billion to really start making personal computers in a major way, they couldn't be found. They were asleep. And they were distracted by mergers and acquisitions and by other financial issues. And they said, no, thank you very much. So it didn't happen. It didn't happen at Xerox. It happened with those people leaving. The Macintosh that came out of Apple was really close to the original Xerox Star. They did actually finally put a product in the market called the Xerox Star, but it was big and clumsy and expensive. They tried to use copy of people to go sell personal computers. It was just a failure of execution or a failure to seize the opportunity. So, there's plenty of examples of companies never figuring out that the future is changing. But there's also, sadly, examples of companies figuring out that the world is changing. But even though they've figured it out and they've diagnosed correctly, they miss the boat because they're not willing to spend the money and do what's necessary to commercialize the products. So here we're in midstream discussing this with Wayne Peacock, CEO of USAA. And he says, well, what do big companies have to do? Well, big companies have to do something which they find it hard to do, which is namely think like a startup. Decide and get on with it. And Wayne goes on to say, if you can get there with 70% of the information, then make the decision and get on with it. There's this enormous desire, and it comes often down from boards of directors. You want precise answers, you want all the information before you make a decision. And those kind of disciplines, which come from the industrial world, don't work when you got a world of deep uncertainty and rapidly changing technology. So by the time you got all the information, someone else has made the investment and you're playing catch up if you're lucky. So he says, think like a startup. And it's not just about jumping in, it's about jumping in and adjusting and adapting and learning. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the so-called lean startup methodology for small companies, but it's also applicable to big companies. And essentially it says, listen, get started because you got to learn. If you stand in one place and don't do anything, you won't learn. And Wayne Peacock goes on to say, accept uncertainty and imperfection, no matter how well you forecast and what might happen, there's still a lot of variability in the environment. At the end of the day, it's the ability to adapt quickly that will define the separation of the winners and the losers. So, this is very much, of course, the Silicon Valley style of management. So I'm not saying anything that people in Silicon Valley don't know. They all know this. They're not necessarily able to do it, but they all know it. It's in their mentality. But I can tell you, you don't have to go very far from Silicon Valley to find that people like to have all their ducks lined up before they make decisions. After all, isn't that the rational thing to do? So think about incumbent automobile companies. That's the way they are used to thinking, and they got to start thinking differently. So enough on that. We'll come back to those themes, but as you can see, there are important decision processes that have to be tuned and aligned with a new world in order to get good outcomes. So, these ideas that I'm putting forward, actually, you just have to, in some ways, bull your way ahead. I've got a quote here from Jeff Bezos. I'll start with the Jeff Bezos quote, and then I'll backfill on it. Here's Jeff Bezos at Amazon saying, there are decisions that can be made by analysis. Unfortunately, there's a whole other set of decisions that you can't ultimately boil down to a math problem. And really what he's saying is it can't be boiled down to a math problem. You don't have complete information. You can't get a clean result, but you still got to decide. And if you go back actually into the work of John Maynard Keynes, a famous British economist, the guy who wrote the book, The General Theory of Wages, Interest, and Employment, that book saved the world from the Great Depression. Well, it didn't save the world. It got the world out of the Great Depression because that's where Keynesian economics came from. But along the way, he's discussing how investors make decisions under uncertainty. And he says, I don't know how investors can decide under uncertainty. The only way I can explain it is I've got, quote, animal spirits. And this is a very famous, every economist, and I'm one of them, knows this term animal spirits from John Maynard Keynes. It's like, if you don't have an answer for why people make decisions and are willing to charge ahead like an animal, then he called it animal spirits. And he said investors continue to invest when there's deep uncertainty. And what he's saying is you don't know what the outcomes are, and there's no easy way to rationalize it, so it must be their animal spirits. So another way of putting this is dynamic capabilities requires animal spirits. So think hard about that. It means you've got to act instinctively rather than rationally in some circumstances. You got to act instinctively rather than rationally, because you can't act in a fully rational way if you don't have information. And despite all the information in the world, you don't have the right information to make decisions, but you still got to make decisions. Needless to say, as I said before, any general in the military knows that's true. That's the so-called fog of war. You don't really know what's going on, but you still got to make decisions. and there's some significant risk associated with them, but standing back and doing nothing is not a good outcome. Go a bit further here. Here is Ajay Banga, CEO of MasterCard. This is a very recent quote from the New York Times, November 2020. And he goes on to sort of say this in a different way. He says, having a sense of urgency to make the decision and take that risk without knowing everything, but having had the patience at the same time to listen to people who know more than you, that's an interesting balance. I've assembled these quotes because most people can't articulate dynamic capabilities, but they know it in their bones. And my job here, because I'm trying to create a framework that can be used for teaching and for research and business, but is to go pull out those statements. And here we have one from Ajay Banga, who is basically saying, you've got to have a sense of urgency and make the decision without knowing everything, but get to know as much as you can. And the way he expresses that is listen to people who know more than you. So always have your ear to the ground. This is not about sitting in isolation and just pressing a button or pulling a lever. That's not the type of decision making we're talking about. We're talking about making decisions where you can get as informed as possible, but don't hang out waiting for the last piece of information to come home, because it never will. Now, part of, and this really ties in with strategy, we're going to have more on strategy here in a moment, but I'm introducing this concept. Part of good seizing and good execution is bringing about, and this is a very woolly concept, alignment and coherence. And what the heck is coherence? Coherence is building a company where the different parts of the company support each other. In crude form, you don't see a Rolls Royce with a Volkswagen grill on it, do you? If you did, you'd say it's incoherent. At the same time, if you saw a Volkswagen with a Rolls Royce grill on it, it wouldn't seem right. It's incoherent, because it's a cheap car, and a Rolls Royce grill is just all pretend. So there are certain obvious things. And to run a company, you need to have the pieces working together so they complement each other and support each other. And so let's take a company like Coca-Cola. It's got three key elements: brand strength and related advertising and promotion. So you don't want to, does Coca-Cola want to make bread? Should Coca-Cola be in the automobile industry? After all, if it's a consumer product, you need some kind of way to answer these questions. So here are the three things that seem to be common to everything that Coca-Cola does. This is spilling, Coca-Cola doesn't advertise these things, but this is, if you stand back, and look down at Coca-Cola from 10 miles in the air, you'll notice everything is built around brand. It's built around in-store distribution. There are Coke machines and so forth, but that's still a mini store. And it's built around a franchising model, not just for distribution, but for bottling. Those Coca-Cola plants that you see all around the world, they're not owned by Coca-Cola. They just have a license from Coca-Cola. And so they've been able to run a global empire of great dimensions by using a franchising model. And it all sort of hangs together. It avoids incoherence. It enables people on the ground to take responsibility and accountability, but it also frees them up to innovate, to renew and refresh. So, those franchise agreements, you've got to, if Coke comes out with a new Coke, you've got to bottle it. You got to produce it. You can't say, sorry, I don't want to make new Coke, or I don't want to do this or do that. The franchise agreement actually has a lot of conditions in it, and you get to take whatever products Coke wants to sell. You don't have a choice on that, but you have a choice in other ways. Lots of other choices that don't matter as much to Coca-Cola. So part of good execution is bringing about good alignment. Now we're backing into another aspect of good execution, particularly in the new economy, and that is, getting all these complementarities worked out, and that requires what I call good or strong asset orchestration skills. We're getting into this sort of concept of ecosystem here, but think about the brilliance of Steve Jobs. Everyone focuses on that little device, the Apple iPod, and say what a cool thing it is. But all it is an MP3 player, a bit more elegant than what went before. The real brilliance of that is not the fact that it's that device, it's what's in it and what's connected to it. And what Steve Jobs understood is that, you couldn't, a device without music available is not a device that anybody wants. And if you remember back to this time period in early 2000, there was so much music piracy around that the recording companies, the studios, the publishers didn't want to have anything to do with the internet. You say the word internet to someone at Sony or someone at any one of the big recording studios, they'd run the other way because they were getting eaten alive by pirates. And Steve Jobs knew enough that you could have software that would protect against piracy. And so, and he didn't invent it, he just found it out there. It's actually got it from Xerox PARC. Digital music encoding, that had been worked out by a number of folks, including the folks at Xerox PARC. And I didn't mention that before, but that was just a byproduct of the brilliant work that was going on there. And so he offered to the broadcasting house, not the broadcasting houses, sorry, the studios who own the recording, who own the music recordings, he offered them IP protection. He said, okay, you get $1 a song, which made them turn over. They didn't like that. They want to be able to, bundle good songs and the bad songs, and they didn't like the $1, but it was better than the alternative, which was nothing, which is what they were getting from the pirates. So they got the $1 a song. He set up the online music store, got the mini hard drive to store the music, and put in the necessary software and hardware to make it all work, to make an ecosystem work. So seizing, as I said before, is about coherence, and it's about getting all the pieces together. And that's why this framework of dynamic capabilities is so relevant, because it says it's about getting the pieces together, whether they are inside the firm or outside the firm. And managers are frequently not used to thinking that way. They think, well, I put this component and that component together, but the notion that you actually pull various strategic partnerships together to pull it off, or strategic alliances or procurement alliances together, of course, it's old hat in Silicon Valley, but at the time, it was not necessarily well recognized. So the point here is that getting everything aligned and orchestrating this, and by orchestrating it, it's not just telling the studios that They'll provide encryption, so you don't have to worry about theft. He then called up the Grateful Dead because he got connections to the artists and said, listen, go kick the studios, because the studios they're still not cooperating. So he used all the pain points and pressure points that he knew of. That's why, as an entrepreneur, it's useful to be networked, and it's useful to be known, and it's useful to be persuasive, because you've got to orchestrate a whole lot of things in order to get a success. So the rest is history, and it went from, of course, the iPod onto the iPhone in a very strategic way. So we're already brushing up against the fact in today's economy, platforms and ecosystems are coming to be of great importance. You're all fully aware of that. What we're not fully aware of is what the implications are for management. We tend to manage the same way as we did yesterday, when in fact it's no longer true. And here's a statement. It's quite old, actually. It's from the mid-'70s. But Paul Samuelson's a Nobel laureate, and when I really want to make a point, I never make it myself. I go find a Nobel laureate who said it, and then people pay attention to it. And here's Samuelson saying back in the mid-'70s, the time is ripe for a fresh, modern look at the concept of complementarity. The last word has not yet been said on this ancient preoccupation of literary and mathematical economists. The simplest things are often the most complicated to understand fully. And I can tell you, by the time we finish this class, we'll have a better understanding of complements, but it'll still be enigmatic. And brilliant minds like Samuelson remind us that this is ancient. People have been thinking through what complements are, whether they're literary economists or mathematical economists, and this question of alignment for management and for strategy. These are very difficult concepts, easy words to say, but hard concepts to understand. So I'll go a little bit further, and then I think we need to stop and get questions from you folks. While we're still talking about Apple, here's the young Tim Cook before he wasn't CEO in 2013, I don't think, but he is now. I had to go all the way to the Taipei Times to find him saying something that's relevant. What they say to the press is so anodyne sometimes because I don't want to give away any of their secrets. But in this class, we're trying to understand the secret sauce that makes a company like Apple work, not the technology, the soft secret sauce. What is it about the management and organization of Apple that makes it a special company? Back then in 2013, here's Tim Cook. Apple still has strong growth opportunities because of its ability to work simultaneously on hardware, software, and services. Apple has the ability to innovate in all three of these spheres and create magic. When you use the word magic, that means there's something enigmatic. It means you can't explain what's going on here. My friend Richard Ramel calls it uncertain imitability. If you tried to recreate Apple's magic, what is it? Be a good exercise for some of you. If you think you know Apple's magic, write it down for me in one page. I'd love to see it. Or write it down for me in a book. I'd love to see it. He goes on to say, this isn't something you can just write a check for. So he's not saying you can't write it down. He's saying you can't buy this. By the way, to me as an economist, this is what I'm looking for. When you can't buy something, the significance of that means that your competitor can't buy it either. It's a very, very important strategic statement. That's something you cannot write a check for. You can't buy it, which means not everybody's going to have it, because a lot of people with big checkbooks, money is everywhere. There's a lot of people with money. There's billions upon trillions of dollars sitting around now that can't find a place to be invested. So it's good news. If you've got something that you can't write a check for, that means you got something special. And he goes on to say, this is something you build over decades. So beautiful statement. You got to search through huge amounts of corporate double speak to really get an honest and crisp statement like that. I'm sure nobody read that and made anything of it, but I did. It's because I'm looking for something very different. I'm trying to figure out and explain to you folks what is the secret sauce of great companies. And it's not something you find in the textbooks. It's something you have to work out for yourself. Now, on this alignment point, we see this going on also with Elon Musk. Here's Peter Thiel. You know, remember the PayPal mafia included Peter Thiel as well as Elon Musk, and so they're good friends. I think Peter Thiel invested in SpaceX too. So when a guy as smart as Peter Thiel looks over at what his friend Elon Musk does, that's what I'm interested in, what Peter Thiel thinks of it. And he says, what's really impressive was integrating all these pieces together. So it tells you something about what management is about. It's about integrating all these pieces. And Thiel goes on to say, it's actually done surprisingly little today. And so I think this is a sort of business form that when people can pull it off, it's very valuable. So this is part of seizing. It's just weaving the pieces together. It's figuring out what pieces you need inside the company. What are the pieces that you can outsource? And you'll know the story with Elon Musk and SpaceX. You know, if you're a new entrant, you'd think, well, let's go to the existing suppliers, and why don't I buy a rocket engine here, and why don't I buy these components over here? Why don't I buy a hatch for the space module over there? What he discovered very quickly is that, yeah, the technology was there, but it was all done by defense contractors who are on cost-plus contracts. So no one was thinking about doing anything cheaply. So he went back to the drawing boards, just like Henry Ford with the Model T, and he basically re-engineered every bit of the rocket. And it's a River Rouge vertical integration story. You know, the early story of Ford Motor Company. They did everything from iron ore and coal through to making the finished product, because there was no supplier industry out there at the time. Now, of course, there's a huge supplier industry, but when you're truly a pioneer in an industry, there's no suppliers to go to. You have to make the supply chain yourself, and that's what Elon Musk has done, to his great credit. And to do it inexpensively at the same time, wow, that's a tall order. So we should take our hats off to these guys who can pull this off. It is amazing. And this is just reminding us again that urgency matters. Part of execution is not just alignment, it's not just integration. You got to do it all very quickly. And you know, it's amazing sometimes. I mean, with COVID, you see how quickly people started making ventilators. It took them a week or two. It's a pretty simple product. But from time to time, people do get focused on doing things quickly. And I mentioned here the Yamaha-Honda motorcycle wars of the 70s, where Honda introduced 113 new models in very short order. Yamaha could only do 37. So this takes very fast decision cycles. And, you know, time does matter, and particularly in large organizations. And, you know, I find it even here at the Berkeley Research Group, my own organization, as we get bigger and bigger, it gets harder and harder to do things in timely fashion, because the more alignment you have, the more consultation, the more integration you have, the more consultation you have to do. So you've got to find ways to do that without busting your routines entirely. And there's plenty of other people that will remind us of the importance of timeliness. And I'll start with the one at the bottom there from my friend Rod Drury, although he claims this is not original. He says, it's not the big that eat the small, but the fast that eat the slow. I think actually it's a combination of both. Certainly not the big that eat the small. The small often eat the big, as was the story with Apple and the iPhone and Nokia. But the fast will certainly eat the slow. Having said that, you don't always have to be the first mover, but you've got to be able to move quickly when the time is right. So don't think of this as, you have to be the first mover. No, you've got to get the timing right. It's as dangerous to be too slow, it's dangerous to be too fast as it is to be too slow. So time matters, urgency matters, particularly in large organizations, simply because they're slow. And through all of this, what I'm downplaying, and maybe if some of my finance colleagues were here, they may be looking askance at me right now, because what I'm saying is, in making investment decisions, financial logic is secondary, strategic logic is primary. Financial logic, is about, buying rather than building. Financial logic, you look for a negative correlation or diversification. With strategic logic, you don't. You look for co-specialization. With financial logic, intangibles play very little role because they can't measure them, they don't know what to do with them. But a good manager will know strategically that intangibles are critical. And when you read the Next Generation Competition paper, if you haven't already done so, and the one that follows it, there's a lot of attention on this. Of course, when it comes to options, yes, finance folks understand options, but with strategic logic, options matter, but they're real options. By real options, we mean the choices. You've got the options to make further investments. You spend money on R&D to get through phase one, then you have the option to do phase two. It's an option that you create for yourself. It's not an option that's there that you can buy. You've actually got to create the options and create choices for yourself. Don't get locked in. Give yourself many outs and ins. And the time horizon, of course, are long versus short, and the metrics are strategic versus financial. And, a company that follows financial logic first, I would say, is a company with weak dynamic capabilities. A company that follows the strategic logic first is likely, or more likely, to have strong dynamic capabilities. So let me stop. That's through the seizing bucket. So let's pause, Ian, and let's see if we've got some questions before moving on to talk about the third bucket, which is transforming.
All right, so we have two questions in the chat that I'll go through first. So first, Kristen brings up the examples of Quibi and Magic Leap as well-funded, well-publicized, and big failures, as in Quibi and quick, short videos for mobile devices and Magic Leap, virtual reality headsets, great ideas, lots of funding failed quite miserably. So the question is, are these examples of uncertain imitability?
I don't know those examples, quite honestly. So take that question down, Ian, and we'll do a little research on it. And in the next class, maybe I'll have something to say about it, because they're certainly good questions, but you caught me flat-footed.
All right. And second, from Kelsey, could you please clarify what co-specialization is?
Yes. Okay. So let's distinguish between complementarity and co-specialization. Complementarity is pepper and salt. You tend to use the one and the other together, but you can put any salt. At least in my cooking, if it says salt, I could use lemon salt. I don't have to use Tibetan salt, or I don't have to use something that's highly specialized. Even though I might have a preference, it'll sort of do the job. And the same thing for pepper. I can use lemon pepper or ordinary pepper. So these are complements, but they're not tied together precisely. Same thing with automobiles. Gasoline is a complement to an internal combustion engine. Now, it turned out, someone told me this story, I don't know if it's true, but in the 1950s, if you owned a Cadillac, you really wanted Union 76 fuel, because it was a little higher octane. It wasn't so standardized, had a little more punch in it, and maybe the Cadillac was a higher compression engine. I just don't know. But once again, that's a complementarity. But if it was such that there was only Chevron gasoline was the only thing that would drive my car, I might say that that's more co-specialized. So co-specialization says that things are really tied together. Think of a left shoe and a right shoe. They're certainly complements, and they sort of are co-specialized. I mean, you can wear somebody else's left shoe in your own right shoe, but it's not going to feel very good. Okay, so once the shoe, this is a good way to put it. When you buy your shoes new, they're complements. By the time you've worn them for a while, they're co-specialized. Now, what that means is you don't have as many competitive choices. The economics of it, you don't have as many competitive choices. And the chances of getting strategic dependency are much greater. If I take away your left shoe, you'll pay me, and let's suppose a pair of used shoes has a value of $10. If I take away your right shoe and you're left with the left one, you might pay me more than $5 to get it back. And that's the nature of the bargaining situation that happens with co-specialization. So, everything inside the Apple ecosystem is co-specialized. Yes, at one level, music and the iPhone are complements. But inside an ecosystem, I don't know if they're completely co-specialized, because you can switch platforms and standards and so forth. But you get the general idea. Very good question, and one that you'll be floundering around with for the rest of your life, as I do. Any more questions, Ian? We exhaust the rest.
None in the chat. Would anyone else like to go ahead? Go ahead. Yeah, you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi. My name is Corey Land. I'm on the strategy team at DataStax, which is a database and kind of expanding to do more in the data infrastructure space. Some question for you tonight is around the transition from sensing to seizing.
Yes.
At my company, we're able on the strategy team to go a little bit slower to research, look at data, see what people are doing. Meanwhile, the ops side is moving fast, executing, and that kind of mixing zone is something we're trying to hone. So I didn't know if you had any advice there. Thanks.
Well, I can address it at a general level. It reminds me of my friend Jiro Nanaka has a piece in the Harvard Business Review about rugby versus relay. Rugby or relay, of course, you hand the baton, you finish the sensing and sense making, and then you hand it on to the seizing. That's relay. Rugby is you pass laterally and back, and so it's really parallel development. Look, anytime you need to do something quickly, you've got to get things moving in parallel before you start the execution, before you finish the sensing and sense making. I mean, yes, maybe you're going to make some slight errors, but maybe you can adjust them. But all of this stuff has to happen semi-simultaneously. I mean, that's, I'm sure that's what happened, how we got vaccines out quickly. Normally, we run it as a relay. You finish this set of tests, and then you start the next set of tests. And, with Project Warp Speed, I just knew if you're willing to spend the money, you can do it in parallel. Well, in commerce today, it's not just the money, it's the time. And if you are in a race, then you've got to be willing to do things in a quasi-parallel fashion in order to get them done quicker. I don't know if that helps answer your question, but the companies that insist on being serial about it are going to miss the boat. Glad you're the first student I can see, and so I've been seeing postage stamps. Now I'm seeing a 6-foot wide image of you. So thank you for popping up on my screen here. Anyone else want to pop up? Okay.
Other questions in person or chat?
Are we done? Thank you, Corey.
All right.
All right. Transforming. There's whole books written about transforming. There's whole books written about every single thing, every sentence they say here. There's a whole books on it, which is the nature of knowledge. It was also true 10 years ago, but every year the amount that's written, quintuples. The amount that's any good doesn't quintuple, but the amount that's written does. So transforming, startups typically don't have this problem because there's nothing to transform. But any established company, and even a fairly young startup, once it gets revenues and once it's starting to move, has got to think about change and transforming and reconfiguring. And you might say, well, so what? If you're smart enough to figure out how to do something in the first place, how to get something going, surely you can learn how to change. Well, the answer is you got things in the way once you get established. Success leads to the accumulation of assets. It leads to the establishment of procedures. It leads to design rules. It leads to routines, which are beneficial. Why does it lead to those things? Because they help. Let's take hierarchy. Let's take bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is a dirty word, right? But actually, if you got a fixed task, a bureaucracy is a good way to execute it. You don't bother to train everybody on everything. You have a set of rules. Bureaucracies are run by rules. If the environment's not changing, you get to figure out what the best rule is, and then you just specialize at doing your little bit, and you'll get better and better. So bureaucracies are elegant when there's no uncertainty, but when there's uncertainty, bureaucracies and rule-based organizations in general have got serious problems or serious issues to deal with. And there's all kinds of words to describe that. Core rigidities is something you'll find in the management literature, and various metaphors like the iron cage. Big corporations are supposedly in iron cages. And the question is, who can let them out of iron cages? That's a very big question. The answer is leaders, not managers, but leaders. I distinguish between entrepreneurs that start companies, managers that run companies, and leaders that change companies. Now, if you're really good, you can do all three. You can be an entrepreneur, you can be a manager, and you can be a leader. In fact, the very best are all of those. But sadly, not everyone is all of those. There are entrepreneurs that are good at starting things, and then you want to move them out of the way. There are managers that can run things, but when it comes time for change, you got to move them out of the way. And there are leaders that can change things, but there may come a point where it becomes regular again, and you don't need as much leadership. Although leadership's always a value, is always valued, just as entrepreneurship is always valued. So, so let's look at this example here. There are certain things, industries that didn't change. The steam locomotive is, just think about this. Why didn't the steam locomotives become the diesel locomotive companies and become the diesel electric locomotive companies? None of them did. General Motors, which was not in the locomotive business, became in the 1930s the leader in locomotives and diesel electric locomotives, as did, I think, Westinghouse. The steam companies did not. Why not? Well, part of it is sensing. There's a quote, I don't have it here on the slide. I'll have Ian dig it up for me. Well, I'll dig it up and give it to Ian so that we can all share it. But the CEO of the, I think it was the Alco Locomotive Company of Philadelphia in the 1930s, said, steam is going to be here through the end of the century, so through the year 2000. Well, in some sense, he was right. I think there was still some pineapple plantations in Fiji that had steam engine. There was some tourist trains that was steam. But within 20 years of him saying that, 80% of the railroads in the United States were diesel electric or electric. So there was a failure to, well, they sensed that the diesel and the diesel electric was coming. They didn't get the sense-making part right. They knew it was coming. You could see them. They were there in the marketplaces. Initially, diesel locomotives were used. They were low powered. They're used for just moving carriages around the yard because they couldn't pull a train over the Rockies or over the Sierras. But within 20 years, within 10 years, they could. So what they got wrong, they got the sensing right. Yeah, diesel's coming, but the sense making, they got the timing completely wrong. But suppose, here's an exercise for you. Suppose the CEOs of the steam locomotive companies had all said, yes, the future is the diesel. Could they have done it? Did they have the right capabilities? Did they have the right ordinary capabilities? The answer is, to some extent, they did. I mean, they knew how to run a vehicle on rails. What did they know about electricity? Well, almost nothing. There was a little steam generator to make electricity to power the headlights and the carriage lights, but that's about it. So they didn't have any of the relevant technical skills. They didn't have any knowledge of electricity. Just like today's automobile companies don't have any knowledge of software. And the automobile of the future is going to be primarily about software. So the steam guys didn't have the right capabilities, but I think the problem is that they didn't understand that they needed to have a different set of capabilities in short order. So we'll always be left with the puzzle. Not one of them came through. It'll be interesting to see in the automobile industry who survives to autonomous cars, which is all about software. Well, not all about software, but mainly about software. And Kodak, look at Kodak. Kodak, once again, they invented a lot of the key elements of digital photography. They had a huge patent portfolio, digital photography, but they didn't make it through. On the other hand, Fuji in Japan did. Fuji, which was a Johnny-come-lately, it had coattailed on Kodak, managed to make the transition. They did at the end, they didn't move into digital photography. They moved into chemistry. They used a lot of emulsion technologies that were involved in photography, and they used that to segue in Penrosian style into pharmaceutical products and into cosmetics. So today, Fuji is about pharmaceuticals and cosmetics, even though we probably still know it for emulsion film. That's really where I think 80% of their business is today. And that's a failure in leadership. Kodak knew it had to do something different. It even brought some Silicon Valley guys in, I forget who it was, to be the CEO, but it was too little too late. And they weren't able to change. They weren't able to lead the organization through to a new future. So it went bankrupt. I think Kodak's still out there, but it went bankrupt. It's tragic. It's tragic. So it says for you folks, you're training as managers. You're not just managing private enterprises. You're involved. You got responsibility for the lives for thousands and thousands of employees. And when you fail, it's not just you lose shareholder value. You turn the lives of employees and suppliers and other groups upside down. So you've got a strong social responsibility to do your job well, not just about bringing home a paycheck. Society is entrusting you with important responsibilities when you're a manager of a large organization. So this is what I was saying a couple of minutes ago about the skill that's required to do this. If it's about administering something, that's management, plus a little bit more. Changing the old, that's a hard part. That certainly requires leadership plus more. Creating the new requires entrepreneurship. So today's brilliant CEO needs to be an entrepreneurial manager leader. So all of you, to the extent to which you aspire to be great, and I assume you all aspire to be great and to make great contributions. If you aspire to be great, you've got to, polish your credentials, not just your credentials, but your own capabilities in each one of these areas. And, I think in business schools, we do a pretty good job at one, teaching administration. And we do, a somewhat okay job about two, though two doesn't always come from business school education. And three doesn't always come from business school education either. But you can get elements of two and three from business school education, and you can certainly get most of one from business school education. But there's a lot you have to learn in life and on the job to be able to be a great leader, manager, entrepreneur, an entrepreneurial manager leader. IBM's done it once. The question is, can it do it again? And Sam Palmisano, who's been gone for quite a while, points out that transformation and innovation in general is not just about the technology. It's also about reinventing. It's about invention, yes, but not just inventing technology. It's about inventing business processes and building entirely new markets that meet untapped customer needs. So this is a good reminder that business people and management, knowledge of management, and what we're talking about here with dynamic capabilities is incredibly important. And it's as important as coming up with the technology itself. In fact, the reason why I've written most of what I've written is to try and steer companies away from the tragedies of inventing, but not innovating. By that, I mean, if you invent, you get the new technologies created. Innovation is about also bringing it through to market and making it successful for all the constituencies that are involved. And here, just to show you, I do try and stay current. You may have seen this yourselves in the Wall Street Journal this week, January 19th. Great article on Volkswagen spending billions on electric vehicle and autonomous vehicles, but kind of being left in the dust behind Tesla. There's a few quotes from this article. I hope you read the whole article. But here, the first line, the biggest challenge isn't the technology. You know, for me, I always think of technology as the hard part because everything else to me seems easy. But I've come to realize, one, it's not easy, and secondly, the people with the technology frequently don't understand a lot of these other things that are easier to understand in some ways. So the biggest challenge isn't the technology, it's the mindset of the people that tells you that it's about culture, their reluctance to embrace radical change until circumstances force them to. Well, isn't this true of society in general? I mean, look at our politicians in Washington. They won't deal with anything until it's in their face. They kick the can down the road on everything to do with budget deficits and God knows what else. It's only when there's a crisis that they act. So that means no leadership. You know, the hallmark of a leader is you get to the problem before it's a crisis. So the first bullet there, while VW's cars excelled in old world features such as spaciousness and design, along comes Tesla, beats VW hands down on such metrics as battery range and advanced computing. In fact, you know, the difference is Tesla is a car built around a computer, and Volkswagen is a car into which they're trying to insert computing. Who's going to win? You know, answering these questions, and not only management questions, are great investing questions as well. If you understand dynamic capabilities, you can be better at picking the winners of the future. I have an aspiration, by the way, to build a dynamic capabilities public securities fund at some point in the future. So if any of you are interested, let me know. But I do think that there's a set of ideas here. If we can get it down to a set of metrics, shouldn't have any trouble beating the best at asset management. Because as you'll come to understand from this class, the set of ideas that we've got together here, first of all, they're hard to understand. Secondly, no one else is really systematically trying to understand them in the way that we are here together. So the article goes on to say VW and its suppliers had to adopt new ways of working together that created integrated teams. Why integrated teams? Because the way that VW is trying to bring software and electronics is they start component by component. You know, where was the first place that's computing went into the automobile? It was in the fuel injection, you know, trying to deal with environmental problems. And then ABS braking shows up. Where's the computer? It's in the brakes, from the braking system. So, you know, you end up with, you know, essentially fragmented approach to computing. And along comes Elon Musk, starts with a whole new conception of what an automobile is about. And of course, all the guys on Wall Street think he's a nutter. You can see last year when all the shorts were over Tesla and Musk was wanting to stand up and say that these shorts were socially, well, first of all, he was out to beat the shorts. It's a matter of pride, but he thought they were bad people, really just trying to destroy his company. They weren't bad people trying to destroy his company. They were just people that didn't understand that he had a different conception, and he's likely to beat the leaders of the industry, such as Volkswagen. You know, I think VW will get its act together here, but of question is, where will Tesla be in the meantime? By the way, I'm not giving advice to buy or sell Tesla stock. If you've got good advice, please let me know. So this tells you, we're talking about transformation, and Elon Musk has got an easier job than the CEO of the Ford Motor Company. Elon Musk doesn't. All he has to do is build a car from the beginning, from a computer out. If you're at the Ford Motor Company, you're General Motors, you're Volkswagen, you're Toyota, you got a different problem. You got to change everything about the organization. You've got now all of this baggage, which is the existing organization. Yes, they know how to make things. They know the techniques of mass production, but their habits are all wrong, because the set of skills they have are all wrong. They're great mechanical engineers, and how many computer scientists does General Motors have? What's the density of computer scientists or people with computer science training at General Motors as compared to Tesla? I imagine it's orders of magnitude lower at General Motors. So this industry has to transform itself. This is going to be the most massive industrial, if it happens. It has to happen. It's going to happen one way or the other. It's either going to happen from the outside or the inside, but it's going to be the most massive industrial transformation of any industrial sector ever, because it's such a big sector. And the quote here is, the global auto industry thinks it sees its future and it will require a transformation without precedent in business history. Okay, that's what we're saying here. I think that's correct. It's a huge one. The auto industry has to turn itself into a nimble provider of software and services. That's kind of pretty anemic way of saying, they've got to become software companies, software and service companies. So think of the challenge of building a software and service company. Think of that as one challenge, and think of a different challenge, which is taking a company that's a hardware company and turning it into a software and service company. Which challenge would you like to have? Think about that. Here is my effort. That last statement there, this will require transformation without precedent in business history. Before I saw that statement, I had made this diagram here, which on the horizontal axis has the amount of technological disruption that's taking place because of not just moving from internal combustion to electric and to hydrogen, but also changing the business model. So we've got simultaneously technological change and business model change happening at the same time, because we have the internet and 5G and all of that. So you've got not only a change in the motive power, if you will, of a vehicle, and the industry had been through this before, because back in 1905, you had steam cars, you had electric cars, you had internal combustion engine cars. Maybe there's some other motive power. I don't think so, though. There were no hydrogen cars, but there were commercial, there's a Stanley steamer. You could go buy a Stanley steamer, pretty elegant car. And faster than internal combustion engine cars. I mean, if you wanted a fast car, you didn't buy an internal combustion engine car, you bought a steamer. The Stanley steamer was the fastest car available. And the electric cars, well, back then and now, they're okay around town, but battery technologies and so forth are pretty pathetic, but they were electric cars. And along comes Henry Ford with the Model T, and we standardized on the internal combustion engine. Actually, and not just internal combustion engine, but we standardized on engine at the front. Remember, before the Model T, a lot of cars had engine in the back. A steering wheel wasn't even standard back then. You could have a pole or a lever on some cars and a wheel on others. So a lot of things became standardized with the Model T. So it was engine in the front, it was 4 wheels, not 3. It was closed body eventually. And so the industry's been through the transformation, but before that first transformation, it was fragmented. Now it's consolidated around the internal combustion engine, and with generally engine in the front still, some examples of engine in the rear, and 4-wheel drive, 2-wheel drive, and that now we're going through a technological disruption that is far greater than the original technological disruption compared to what was there before. But we've also got this business model disruption as well. Mobility as a service, connected car. And at the same time, we've got, competition from complements. If you're Ford or General Motors or Toyota, you've also got Uber and Lyft that are using cars in very different ways from what you imagined, and potentially overturning the type of cars that need to be produced. So here you have, if you will, this multiple paradigm changes taking place simultaneously. So this is going to be surviving this. If I would guess, I wouldn't think more than 1 out of 10 automobile companies will survive. But I may be wrong. And if they do survive, it'll probably be through joint venture arrangements where they'll end up builders for Apple. Apple, there's now serious talk about the Apple car. And Apple will find somebody to build its car just as it finds somebody to build its iPhone. So when you realize that the essence of the automobile is now the software, you don't necessarily have to be a manufacturer any more than you have to manufacture the iPhone. So it's not just manufacturing companies that have to transform, it's also banks. And you're on difficult ground when you start saying that a bank should embrace risk, because the whole idea of banking is to steer away from risk. But this is not financial risk, this is business risk, and organizational risk. Here we have Royal Bank of Canada, Dave McKay, saying we've introduced a new leadership model where we ask leaders in clear language to lead in a more ambitious way. We have encouraged them to be even more fallible, to say to the teams, we're not going to get it all right. Of course, you got the Federal Reserve regulators and your local regulators, bank regulators, looking over your shoulder. So you got to be very careful what you say, because there's danger that the regulators will think, quote, you're taking on too much risk. But as we talked about in the last class, sometimes if you take on too little risk, it's as dangerous as taking on too much risk. So risk is not something that we should always be afraid of. Embracing risk may be the way to the future. I've tried to give some structure to this by talking about change distance. And there's 3 dimensions. If you're trying to move from one market to another, if you're Kodak trying to get into if you're Coca-Cola trying to get into the snack business, well, now they're in it, but that's pretty small change in market distance. But if Coca-Cola was trying to get into the bread business, that would be a big change in market distance. Business model distance, the automobile companies, maybe we're going from an ownership model through to not just a rental model, but to a leasing model, or through no one will buy a car in the future. Maybe they have to deal with just Ubers and Lyfts wanting to buy their cars. How is that going to change things? So that the business model distance is great, and the technological distance is great too. So so you can define the distance, the capability distance you have to travel by looking at these three dimensions. So the difference between A and Z here is a measure of the distance you have to travel. What I should also do is a diagram which says it's a lot easier to go along one of those axes than to try and go along all three. Distance, the hardness or the cost, if you will, of change is greater the further you're away from each one of those three axes. I'm sure you folks can think of a better diagram to draw, but that's the only one I've been able to draw about this so far. So let's pause again to see if there's any questions before I begin talking about strategy. I've said that sensing, seizing, and transforming the three buckets of things you have to be good at. I'm really about to add a fourth bucket, which is strategy, but it cuts through all the other three. So it's not as contained as the other three, so I'm going to deal with it separately. But before I do so, let's see if there's any questions.
Yes, so we have actually 5 in the chat and 1 raised hand. So going through in order, first from Jeff. Professor Teece, your thoughts on any analogy between Alco and the steam engine and current CEO dismissive comments about Zoom and video conferencing?
Sorry, can you give me that one again, please?
Sure. So do you see any analogies between the Alco president in the 1930s dismissing the rise of diesel and non-steam technologies, and CEOs now dismissing the rise of Zoom and video conferencing for corporate work?
I didn't realize anyone was dismissing Zoom and video conferencing. What are they saying, that virtual reality is going to displace it, or what?
No, I think, Professor, I think it's the airline CEOs dismissing the video conferencing.
Oh, airline CEOs say that we're going to go back to flying around. Is that your point? That we're no, look, I think that we've learned new habits, and most of those habits are going to stay. I always believed before COVID there was way too much conferencing and too much ridiculous flying around, but there were certain standards and norms that you had to comply with. So I don't know if that bears directly on what you're saying, but the new normal is not going to be the old normal, and I think what's happened is that we've accelerated probably, in 1 year, what would have otherwise taken a decade in terms of a gradual transition towards more video conferencing versus versus face-to-face. And I think with virtual reality just around the corner, I think it's going to slow that down. It's going to enable us to work remotely more so than before. So I don't know. Maybe you can have a follow-up question, because I don't feel I'm answering your question very well.
Let's see, Jeff, do you have a follow-up to that at all? Or you could also ask it afterwards.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Teece. It speaks to that broader, the CEOs of Delta, American Airlines, United are all telling investors that business class travel is going to return. And their comment was, the first time someone loses a deal to a competitor who met face to face, then people will stop using Zoom. To me, that your comment about the locomotive reminded me of that. And so either speaking to that directly or more broadly, as you said, what changes are occurring because of COVID that, the new normal will not be the old normal?
Yeah, I think I think there's something around accepted norms that's at issue here, and actually let me give you a little bit of a personal experience. So one of the things that we do as a family, we have Mount Beautiful Vineyards, and we're selling like 30,000 cases of wine here. And pre-COVID, you know, how do we do? You know, how do we do wine tasting to our buyers? Well, you show up and you go to a restaurant and you present them with the bottles, and you know, maybe if you're lucky, you can squeeze 3 or 4 tastings in a day, and maybe you get, you know, 2 out of 4 restaurants, if you're lucky, to adopt to take your wine. Well, now you know, when you get rid of the sales force, so the CEO does it, and it takes him an hour and a half, and you know, you send the bottle of wine ahead of time. You know, you could have, the technology was there to do this before, but why didn't you do it? You didn't do it because everyone was out there on the street, and if you're out there on the street, it was kind of like, if you weren't out there on the street, it's like you didn't care as much. And maybe it'll return to that, but I don't think it will, because I think it's actually easier for people. You don't have to deal with people coming in, having a time where they, you know, you got to escort them into the building and take them out the back, et cetera, et cetera. It's just simpler and more efficient. And so when humans behave, when new norms get established in society, then it's easier for you to do things. So I think that it's not just that we learn things, it's that the norms change. That's the point I'm trying to make. So doing a deal without seeing someone face to face with virtual reality, I mean, what the heck is going to be the difference? Okay, you can't smell them, but you can see them and you can talk to them. You can't shake their hand. Well, maybe someone will come up with a way that there's a hand on my desk that'll shake the same way that the person on the other side wants to do it. I think it's a bit of wishful thinking on the part of the airlines, quite frankly. There will, of course, be a burst. Everyone is going to want to do some travel when these lockups are over and everybody's vaccinated. The cork will come out of the bottle for a while and they'll get a shot in the arm. Yeah, I think I saw predictions that the industry would return to normal in like 4 to 5 years. That's sort of with a standard conventional wisdom. And it'll return to something. It won't be quite the same as it was before. I think in a way, I think people feel the freedom. You know, another norm is that you don't, if you're not seen in the office, it doesn't mean you're not working. I mean, I do believe that offices will remain a key part of business life, but you know, I must admit for myself, I kind of felt if you're not in the office, people are going to think that maybe you're goofing off, but nobody thinks that way anymore, even if they did in the first place.
I'm going to comment to Jeff's comment. First off, I agree with what he said about, I think the airlines might be underestimating it, and the power of Zoom and video conferencing is good. As a professional salesman who's worked for 4 companies since I've graduated and did President's Club at all 4 of them, your comment about, you know, when you lose your competitor because he was there, I'll be that competitor taking your business because I will be there. And that is how President's Club people win. So I'm not saying I'm going to travel like I did before, but I am telling you, you can't beat the relationship and you can't beat the handshake. And there's nothing like sitting in the room, you know, working with people. So I won't travel nothing like I did. I'll guarantee that. But when the deal's on the line, I'm going to be in front of that customer. Yeah.
All right, so to me, that's it'll go back to maybe 80% of what it was, but you're right. There's very good reasons for face-to-face, and there's still something. Technology is not closing the gap completely. That's for sure. But it is a lot cheaper than, you know, getting in your car and driving around and finding parking and the amount of wasted time there. Although we've increasingly found ways to multitask while we're doing all those other things.
Agreed. I mean, it's definitely has accelerated change, and I think it's been good.
Yeah.
All right.
Great insight.
Great. So,
Ian, anything?
Yeah,
Any
we've
other
got
questions?
a few others actually. So,
All right.
Christian, you're next if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. Hey, Professor Teece, my name is Christian Matheson. I'm an engineering manager at LinkedIn. So a lot of these examples you've been mentioning, I think Kodak, the steam engine, all this stuff, it kind of reminds me of some stuff a lot of us been taught in other classes, the Innovator's Dilemma by Clay Christensen. And for those not familiar with it, basically the too long didn't read version of that is that companies, in order to survive long term, they need to invest and innovate in technologies that are inefficient at first and are not their core competencies, and then eventually they will become better and good enough to commercialize at scale. But how does this all relate to dynamic capabilities? Is this a type of dynamic capability, or how does it fit in?
Okay, so actually, we got to get on to this later. Maybe not today, but next time. But Christensen has, the Innovator's Dilemma. Then he has another book called The Innovator's Solution. Dynamic capabilities is the innovator's solution. It's a very poor book. You should go look at it. And I looked at it recently, and I realized, okay, the book he was trying to write is the one that you're getting here, which is dynamic capabilities. That is the way to avoid the innovator's dilemma. Now, there's Clay is a good friend of mine, as you know, he's passed away. And there's some important insights in what he had to say. If I remember right, his primary idea was that, it was the low cost guy coming in from below that would end up taking the market. Somehow or other, managers are supposed to be systematically blind to this. And indeed, I think that it's not just the low cost guys coming up from below, it's sometimes the high cost guys coming down too that can eat your lunch. So, he was looking at the disk drive industry, which, certainly had evidence to support what he was saying. So look, I think all of this is related. As you'll see in just a moment, Clay gets credit for this term disruption, which actually is really what Joseph Schumpeter was talking about in the 1930s. He just popularized it. But anyway, the way it relates to what we're doing is he's talking about the problem. He's talking about sensing. He's saying these guys keep missing the boat. But he really doesn't tell you what the solution is. And what my solution here is, you got to get better at sensing and sense making. You got to get better at seizing, and you got to get better at transforming. So he's playing around in box number one, sensing, because he doesn't really tell you what to do about it. He just says, please avoid this. Look over your shoulder, because someone may be coming from behind. It's pretty banal at some level. But it comes from Harvard, so, it gets good currency. We got another question there, Ian?
Yes. Well, we have a few more, so we'll go through. Let's see, from Jeff, Professor Teece, would you think that the automotive industry is alone in needing to change, or is it bound to the immobility of the oil industry that is twice as stuck in the transition to EVs and software?
Actually, the oil industry uses a heck of a lot of software with respect to exploration, but I didn't catch the first part of the question. Is it, sorry, Ian, read that back again.
Right. So, right, would you think that the automotive industry is alone in being stuck, or is it co-stuck with
is it alone or is it co-stuck? Good question. Well, let's talk about the oil industry. The oil industry gets better every year at finding oil, and they're incredibly good at big data. the exploration end of the industry is where some of the fanciest supercomputers are used, and there's huge amounts of data being produced every nanosecond from the industry through, not just through exploratory activities, but through oil field management activities. So they've got a lot of technology, but its problem is it's all around fossil fuels. And the question is, can they repurpose that technology? You know, they've got distribution, they've got energy distribution through the retail side, they've got refining, although most of them have kind of gotten out of refining. The Exxons of the world have divested, actually they've divested, most of the oil companies have divested distribution and they've divested refining. Really where they're focused is where the money is, which is finding oil. In fact, you know, you've heard the old cliche, where do you find oil? It's not in the ground, it's in the mind. Well, it's not in the ground and it's not out of the ocean, it's in the mind. And so it's all about essentially algorithms and data analysis. You know, it's more like the drug discovery business than it's like a natural resource industry. It's been that way for 20, 30 years, that people still think of it as a natural resource industry, whereas I think of the oil industry as basically a software industry. I've thought about it in those terms for a long time, because that's where the money's made, it's in exploration. But the question is, can they use those big data skills to go compete against Amazon? You know, maybe. They certainly can got the computation bit down, but the uses of the data are very different. They don't have consumer data, they've got geophysical data. And so there's a huge transformation that they would have to do to take the data management skills and get across. You know, on that diagram I had market distance. You know, so actually on the technology distance, go back to that figure. Oh, I can do it myself, hang on. Yeah, right here. So the oil industry has got a problem on the market distance. I would say on the technology distance, it doesn't have that far to go. On the business model distance, yes, it's got a very long way to go. There we go. Capabilities is not just about technology. It's about business models and about market distance too.
All right. Let's see.
Now, there was a second part of that
Yeah.
question: is its problem bigger or smaller than the automobile industry? And are the two married? The two are complementary. Look, so the oil industry, just to finish that thought, I'm thinking about the majors, but of course the distribution companies, I mean, they should be able to have hydrogen filling stations, you know, so at least they get, and electricity charging stations. So the distribution end has got a place. The refining, well, you're not going to be able to make pasteurized milk in a petroleum refinery or anything like that. So I think that's going to be a tough one. So the refining assets are going to be very hard to repurpose. They're highly specialized. They're not generic at all. Yeah, they can do heavy crude, light crude, low sulfur, high sulfur, but that's about as diversified as they are. But marketing, yes, there's some assets there that can be repurposed. But you know, another question is, can they get into alternative fuels? Do they have any technological benefit in getting into wind and solar and so forth? And the answer is not really, because they're not, you know, what they're really good at is big, huge, complex projects. And, you know, most windmills and wind farms, you know, they're fairly small projects. Yeah, okay, you may have, you know, a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand of them, but it's not managing things on the scale that building the Trans-Alaska Pipeline is all about, or the Trans-Siberian Pipeline is all about. Next one.
All right. Well, let's see. So at this point, it's a minute after 7:30, so we could pause and resume the questions after the break, if that works.
All right. So let's take a 15-minute break, and we'll come back, finish the questions, and maybe there's more that get added. And then we get to talk about strategy and dynamic capabilities. And then, well, we won't even get into we'll get into alternative paradigms probably as well, but not much further.
Great. Okay. So yes, if you've asked in the chat, I've queued it up and we'll resume in about 15 minutes. I'll be back here in about 5 minutes or so, but yes, resuming at 7:45.
Thank you.
Thank you.